but let me start with the introduction so long. So I'm very pleased to be hosting this webinar. This is one in a series of collaboration of many universities and SAHO, thanks to Omar Badsha, who brought us all together with Ariana Lissoni from Wits University, from the Wits History Workshop. And this is the centenary of the South African Communist Party. As part of that centenary, we are running a series of webinars called Lineages of Socialism in Africa. And really what we're trying to explore is the quite diverse history of the SACP and its influence in various ways. And this is not the very last seminar, but chronologically, it's the seminar which is going to focus on the current and future of socialism in South Africa. So the title of the webinar, which is a two-part webinar, is Forward to Socialism / Socialist Futures. Now, it sounds a bit odd to have such a strange title, but really it makes sense when you look at the way in which we've structured these two panels. So we got a number of participants applying to be part of these panels, and including Communist Party members, as well as independent academics and people who have been involved in different ways or in the struggle for socialism in South Africa. And the first panel is really focused on socialism and state power in South Africa since 1994. So we're looking here at how the transition to socialism. Has there been a transition to socialism? If not, why not? What has been the SACP's program? What has been its role, its influence in the ANC government since 1994? And I think we're going to have a really interesting debate this morning on that topic. I'll introduce you to the speakers just now. And then the afternoon session, this afternoon session is on the future, and it's called Socialist Futures, Eco-Socialism, Feminism, and Alternative Futures. So what is the future for socialism in South Africa, if any? And how do we understand that? What role has the SACP played in imagining alternative futures and in strategizing towards achieving those alternative futures? And how does the SACP see that now, at the moment? So it should also be a very interesting session. So you can see the distinction between the two sessions. But we're going to start off this morning with the session on socialism and state power in South Africa. And I've got a very nice panel lined up. I have one apology. I'm very sorry that John Reynolds from Rhodes University is not able to join us due to ill health. So he sent his apologies, but I think we will have plenty to discuss among the other participants. So this is the way it's going to run. The order of speakers, we're going to start with Gary Prevost and Lolonga Tali. This is hosted by Nelson Mandela University, so you'll understand a number of the participants are researchers from Nelson Mandela University. And Gary Prevost, who is a research associate, he's an honorary professor in the Department of History and Political Studies here. He's a long-standing associate of our university and involvement in South African politics and anti-apartheid politics even before the transition. And he is currently working as the supervisor of one of our doctoral students. This is Lolonga Tali, who is the presenter of the research on this topic. And they are looking at an analysis of the role of the SACP in formulating development policies, in particular the RDP and the National Development Plan. So that's the first participant in this session. And then we have Pedro Mzileni, who is also a lecturer in sociology and anthropology at Nelson Mandela University. And he will be the second presenter. Then we'll have a little bit of a break. I'm going to give each panelist 20 to 25 minutes. I'll give Gary and Lolonga 30 minutes just because there are two of them, 30 minutes between the two of them. And Pedro, if you can have 20, 25 minutes to present, and then we'll have a little bit of a response and discussion to them. And then we will go on to the next two presenters. So we have then Patrick Brennan, who is also working at Nelson Mandela University as part of the Transition Township Project. And finally, Jeremy Cronin, who I'll introduce to you later, but I'm sure you all know of him as one of the South African Communist Party leaders. So that will provide a very interesting balance and engagement for discussion. And I hope that all of you who are participating will be part of the discussion as well. And we should have plenty of time for discussion. So if you're all happy with that and you're all ready, I'm going to ask Gary and Lolonga. Lolonga, can you share your screen, or would you like me to share the presentation? No, there, he's got it. Great, thank you very much.
Lolonga, you need to unmute.
Am I unmuted now?
Yes, you are unmuted. Please go ahead.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Professor, and also good morning to everyone. I guess probably it's good evening to Professor Prevost. Indicator is analysis of the role of the SACP in the development from the reconstructed development plan to the national plan, or alternatively known as NDP 2030. What I'm going to do is that I'll concentrate more on the set questions. I'll give over to Professor Prevost to do the primary findings and conclusion. The research questions are going like this. The first one is the SACP's role in shaping the freedom chart focus on nationalization of key inners. How did the SACP approach negotiations with the National Party from 1990 to 1994? We all know that the negotiations started after the late President Nelson Mandela was released on the 11th of February, 1990, and then the organizations were unbanned on the 2nd of February, 1990. So when the negotiations started, the SACP was part of the ANC delegation, although initially there was some opposition to the presence of one among others, Joe Slovo, but it had to happen because he was part of the alliance. The second question is, what role did the party play in the shaping of the reconstruction and development program that emerged as ANC policy after the negotiations? With the RDP, of course, as it was known, it was the brainchild of COSATU. COSATU being part of, then when the ANC was unbanned, it became part of what was then called, and what is still now called, the Tripartite Alliance, together with the SACP and the ANC, seeing that the ANC never had any economic policy after it was unbanned. So COSATU, with its own research group, crafted together this reconstruction and development program. It later transpired that some members of the SACP were also part of that one. And then the third question is, how did the party respond when the RDP was abandoned and replaced with a more neoliberal approach to the South African economy? In 1996, at the helm of the government, 1999, but 1996, Mbeki, the former president, was a deputy to first President Nelson Mandela. He was doing much of the work, whereas Madiba was more concerned in trying to foster reconciliation in the country. Thabo Mbeki, together with a few other individuals, crafted what was then known as the Employment and Redistribution Program, popularly known as GIE. Now, GIE was crafted, the office which was handed by a former Secretary General of COSATU, J. Naidu, was closed, and J. Naidu was absorbed into government as communication. Now, unlike the RDE, or liberal economic system that was by Mbeki and many other authors and academics are clear on that GIE was made without consultation of the alliance partners. They were only shown some pages of GIE, just it was adopted as government policy. The next question, how the SACP use the changing global environment in the early 2000s to embrace more progressive approaches to development policy like New Growth Path. Mbeki was replaced from 2007 as president of the ANC by former President Jacob Zuma. In 2008, in September, Mbeki was recalled by his own party, the ANC, and for a time, the president became Kgalema Motlanthe. After the 1999 elections, President Zuma was the president of the ANC. After the ANC won the elections, he became president. And the ANC, after that, that elective conference came with another policy, which was called the New Growth Path. The next question is, what has been the role of the SACP in promoting and developing the National Development Plan 2030 or NDP 2030? Now, having read some literature on that one has discovered that the SACP claims that at least it played a sterling role in the drafting of the National Development Plan. I'm not going to dwell on that one. Professor Prevost will deal with that one. The question becomes then, does the NDP square with the SACP goal of constructing socialism in SA? SACP in the late 1990s or early 2000s adopted a slogan which went like this: socialism is the future, build it now, to underscore the fact that what it wanted greatly was the establishment of a socialist state in South Africa. So the question then becomes, does the NDP really square with that goal of constructing socialism? The last question is, has the presence of SACP members in cabinet from 1994 to the present resulted in any significant way in the implementation or in the implementing of the program of the party? If not, why not? Since 1994, most SACP members have been in cabinets of the ANC, as the governments of the ANC have changed since 1994. Now the question becomes, have these members been able, as their presence, been able to play a role in the implementation of the party program? I think that was the last question. I'm going to hand over to Professor Prevost to deal with the research findings.
Thank you, Tali. If you could move to the second screen with our findings. Our first finding relates to a subject that has been quite a bit studied, but still in some ways needs additional research. Our research basically uncovered that the SACP at that moment of the release of Nelson Mandela and the unbanning at that particular point, through party documents and statements, was very much still committed to the significant program of nationalizations in the post-apartheid South African economy that it had staked out for decades, including its well-known role in helping to shape the Freedom Charter in 1955. But 1990, of course, was a very interesting and difficult moment in world history for those that advocated socialism because of the fall in 1989 of the East European socialist systems across the board. Also at that same time, by 1990, another leading communist party in the world, from People's Republic of China, was embracing market solutions. And the third factor, born really of those first two, was that worldwide, neoliberal thought was very much in the ascendancy, marked by Francis Fukuyama's end of history narrative and the idea that socialism had lost all relevance for the for policy and policy making at the end of the 20th century. That was the context in which the South African Communist Party, together with its partners, the COSATU and the ANC, entered into the negotiations. Now, in our review of party documents, we never found a direct acknowledgement that it was reversing its position on nationalization. There was not really an acknowledgement that what I now see as a clear trade that was made by the leadership of the ANC for political power in exchange for walking away from a significant set of nationalizations in the South African economy. That historic bargain compromise never really directly acknowledged by the SACP. And instead, as Lolonga indicated, what happened during that time period was that the SACP, with the assistance of COSATU, developed the RDP program. And when it was implemented by the ANC government in 1994, it was actually viewed by the SACP as a very positive development that would move South Africa toward the longer range goals of the party to achieve socialism. And they and others were quite proud of the fact that the RDP at that point in 1994 was running counter to the worldwide neoliberal trend. They're very positive about it and believed that it was, if you will, a very strategic, positive retreat from what had been the policy on nationalizations and the economy coming into the negotiations. As Lolonga indicated, our finding, again, not all that new, was that when the more conservative GEAR program was adopted in 1996 by the ANC government, the SACP and its trade union allies were largely sidelined and not seriously consulted, even though the party was well represented in the cabinet. And in many ways, looking over the totality of the SACP's influence over South Africa's development policy, this episode particularly underscored the limitations of the party's influence on South Africa's development policies, though that would be reversed to a degree with later developments. Tali, you can move to the next slide. That reversal really began at the 2007 ANC Polokwane elective conference, where the SACP and COSATU took advantage of a changing world environment, which had turned against neoliberalism and pushed the ANC in a more progressive direction. Just a reminder, by 2007, the promises that had been made by the neoliberals worldwide at the time of the collapse of East European socialism in the early 90s had generally shown to be totally false and inadequate, and was marked especially by the triumph in Latin America of governments of the left in Brazil and Venezuela and in other countries that were challenging neoliberal orthodoxy. And the SACP and COSATU took advantage of that moment to begin to press for an ANC development policy that was more progressive and less neoliberal. Both alliance partners, as everyone on this call is well aware, used the candidacy of Jacob Zuma to pursue that agenda. And continuing in that administration, which emerged from the developments within the party and the elections, placed SAC members in key ministries responsible for the implementation of the party's more progressive agenda. Tali, if you can move to the next slide. Tali?
The next slide, I've already loaded it.
That the two most prominent individuals that we speak of here are Rob Davies, who everyone knows as a SACP Central Committee member, headed the Department of Trade and Industry, obviously a key ministry in the implementation of South Africa's development policy. And also Ibrahim Patel, a member of COSATU and a leader of the South African Clothing and Textile Workers Union, headed the Department of Economic Development. And Davies, in his role as the Minister of Department of Trade and Industry, was involved in the introduction of a very state-oriented industrial action plan. Tali, we seem to have lost the screen. Well, we may have some technical difficulties with the screen sharing that relate to Janet. Are you possibly able to resurrect it? Otherwise, I will not hold us up. I will move forward. Tali seems to be back, but I think there are some technical.
Gary, I'll put up the screen if you want. You can carry on talking so long. I know Lolonga's got it back up, I think.
Right.
Just wait a minute. There we go.
And okay.
I think you can carry on, Gary.
Then the Zuma administration, I think as everyone is well aware, with the support of the SACP and COSATU, adopted the National Development Plan 2030 as an overarching framework for its anti-neoliberal developmental state approach. That plan, which you will hear me say, in preparation for today, I think we had maybe hoped to arrive at a few more definitive judgments about that. But what was clear was that in contrast to GEAR, and more like the RDP, The SACP, through its cabinet ministers, has definitely been involved and was involved in both the formulation of it and the implementation of the NDP. In many ways, it looked more like the events of 1994, but without the consummate 1996 results, where the work of the SACP in formulating and attempting to implement the RDP was eventually undercut. We do not see the same result occurring with the National Development Plan. It has been very much involved and continues to be involved at the highest levels in the implementation of this policy. And it is clearly one which sees the state as lying very much at the center of the country's economic development. It stands obviously in very much in contrast to the more neoliberal ideas that had been dominant in the early 90s. And in some ways, it now more represents what has been called by some, in contrast to the Washington consensus of the neoliberal ideas, the Beijing consensus. And in a certain sense, the approach of the Chinese Communist Party, while still very much using market mechanisms and in many ways embracing the market, still very much has the state at the center of its economic development plans, with 5-year plans and the like. And so in that regard, it seems to me that the SACP, through the ANC governments, has sought much more to pursue what might be called a Beijing consensus. We can have, and I think much more research needs to be done to actually analyze arena by arena how that has worked out in practice in South African government developmental policy. Our final conclusions really on the question of the influence is that for us, questions very much remain whether the policies of the SACP being pursued under the NDP well represent a progressive notion of the developmental state, much less a path of socialism. As we started this project, I think maybe Lolonga and I had hoped to be a little further along by the time of this presentation to make some policy by policy judgments on that. But I think in the spirit of research work here at the university, that's something which we still leave to further research, to go through some of the specific policies and come to judgments as to whether they are in fact moving South Africa further in the direction of socialism. I should note that I just slightly passed over one of the judgment that we clearly do make, and that other scholars, Tom Lodge and others, have been making in answering the question of, has the presence of South African Communist Party ministers at the highest levels of South African government over these 30 years, has it always resulted in moving forward the policies that the party seeks to implement? And our answer to that really is no. It has not always resulted in that kind of implementation. And that comes from the fact that the ministers are there as members of the South African Parliament, not elected as SACP delegates, but as ANC delegates, and therefore often find themselves in the difficult position of having to implement policies that are decided by the ANC in a broader basis with more conservative elements involved that lead to those policies. I will leave it there.
Wonderful. Thank you, Gary. Very good time as well. Lolonga, I don't know if you want to say anything else at this point. I know we had a little bit of a problem with your sound. Go ahead.
No, nothing to say at the moment. At least I think everything has been met as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, great. All right. So
Thanks.
If there are any immediate responses or questions that you have for the two, I'll take them if you can raise your hand. I can see hands here, so I can't see any at the moment. I think let's go on to Pedro's presentation. Pedro is also looking at some of the policies, but from using the SACP tradition of revolutionary critique to address some of these issues. And he's looking at four key policy programs advanced by the post-94 ANC organizational machinery and government. So he's looking at reconciliation, Vuk'uzenzele, free education, and organizational renewal. And I'll let Pedro speak for himself. So Pedro is one of our, what can I say, up-and-coming independent critical intellectuals at Nelson Mandela University. And he's making quite an impact in Nelson Mandela Bay in terms of local government policy and how we understand the transformation of the local economy. So Pedro, I won't say any more about you. I'll let you have the floor now. Are you there?
All right. Thank you so much, Prof. I hope that I'm audible.
There, and we can see you as well now. Thanks so much. That's great.
Okay. And my voice is fine, right?
Yeah, we can hear you well.
All right. Good morning, colleagues, comrades, and friends. I've been given 25 minutes, but I will probably only utilize 20% of that. And then secondly, I wrote that abstract in February, and a lot has happened since February until now, but I will also not be tempted by the current contemporary developments in our political space. I'll try to stick to the scholarship, but when I looked at the abstract again last night, I realized that there are also a number of issues that I'm not going to touch on. I'm just going to focus on three main aspects. Firstly is the crisis of deindustrialization in South Africa and the consequences of unemployment that it has created in our society, particularly for young people, and how the SACP during this period of deindustrialization sort of betrayed its tradition of providing revolutionary critique to the policy developments in the state and also in society broadly on these questions of the economy. And then secondly, I'll also touch on the aspect of the battle of ideas that the party has been known for, and how NGOisation rather has taken over that space altogether in our society. We now hear of concepts such as service delivery. We now hear of concepts such as unskilled public servants. All these terms are being thrown every day on television, but they are never provided with a critical class analysis in terms of what do they mean, what are their implications, and what are their envisaged consequences as far as the revolutionary program is concerned. So I'm only going to touch on those two things and then take a seat. So firstly, I'm glad the previous presenters have touched on the National Development Plan comprehensively, because that seems to be the document on the table that is being pursued by the state, and they are targeting 2030 as the destination for them to realize the key pillars of what that document entails. But one major weakness about the NDP and even the current economic program that is being pursued is that the unemployment rate, comrades, it has never dropped below 23%, 24% over the past 40 years. Not just 27 years. Never mind the aspect of 27 years. I'm talking about 40 years. The past 40 years in South Africa, our rates of unemployment have been extremely too high. And at the core of that problem, I argue, is that, sorry, there's a comment, Prof, saying people can't hear me. Am I audible?
Pedro, you're audible to me. I'm not sure about other people. You're perfectly audible to me.
I can hear him clearly.
Yeah, all of us can hear him clearly.
Yeah, you're heard. Please continue, Pedro.
All right. Sure, thanks for that. So for the past 40 years, the rates of unemployment have been too high. And at the core of that problem, I argue, is because our economy has been deindustrializing for the past 40 years, and there hasn't been an alternative strategy being put in place to revive the industrial sector in South Africa. And if you look at the industrial sector, not only in Africa and South Africa, but across the globe. Across the globe, industrialization is the base of massive job creation. All major economies whose rates of unemployment are almost below 5%, which is being close to full employment, at the core of their economy is a vibrant economy. Now, if you look at our case in the South African context, between 2000 and 2008, which what many scholars term as the period of the jobless growth. During that period, what you'll notice there is that the retail, trade, and finance sector, financial sector, the retail sector, their rates of growth during that period were actually double than the sectors that are largely in the production sector. The production sector being your mining, agriculture, and manufacturing. Yes, they did grow, but not as much as the financial and retail sector grew during that period. So meaning, even at our highest point of achieving growth in this country, the industrial sector was declining during that period. And that is why, therefore, the rates of unemployment have remained extremely high. You are not going to be able to absorb young people into the economy unless the manufacturing sector is the base of the economy. Now, if you look at the National Development Plan and what it seeks to advance as things stand, the aspect of a strong manufacturing and industrial sector is silent in the existing policy economic proposal of the ruling party going into the future. And the critique of the SACP, as far as that aspect is concerned, is not sharply visible. Another point to put on the table is that even though the financial and the retail sector grew during the last decade, the state itself did not take advantage of the period to create and form what I would term a state bank. As the financial and the banking sector was growing in South Africa, the intervention from the state into that financial sector in the form of creating a state bank, it did not happen. The state bank in the South African context would have provided capital and developmental credit to people that are trying to make a living on the margins of our economy. People who are trying to establish small-scale farms, people who are trying to establish small industrial businesses that are labor-intensive in nature. Those young women entrepreneurs have never received tangible support from a state bank in order for them to grow their own sector that would truly emancipate Black communities with genuine and tangible economic empowerment. But the way economic transformation and economic empowerment has been framed in the state has largely been about taking Black people, taking women, and putting them into the existing white companies that have been growing over the past 50 years under the apartheid economy. So the taking of Black people and women into white companies is what has been the dominant notion of economic transformation, instead of the provision of a state bank that would create industrial sectors in Black communities owned and controlled by Black communities for purposes of absorbing young people to have this industrial base that I'm talking about, where the economy is owned by the people. Even on the aspect of education, the crisis is similar. The notion of quality education as well has been about taking Black learners to private white colleges that are located in urban areas. So in other words, if you give Black people white education, then you have achieved quality education in essence. So the movement of Black young people, Black learners, Black children to formal Model C schools is what has been termed as transformation and the delivery of quality education. But if you look at it in simple terms, rural education is collapsing as a result. Yes, it could be largely to the urbanization crisis that we have in the country, where our people are moving to the city in search of opportunities. But the reverse end of that is because the rural development or the rural transformation program has not delivered tangible economic returns for our people, for them to see the rural area as an asset for them to grow their livelihoods from and ultimately continue developing schools for their people. So this cycle where the notion of development is trapped in is the crisis of neoliberalism that has not only infiltrated the state policy apparatus, but it has also infiltrated how the liberation movement itself forms its ideas and forms its own notion of transformation. Now, let me now move on perhaps to my last few points. I do not want to spend time. I just want to throw these thoughts on the table. At the core of this argument is how the traditions of critique by the SACP have largely been ignored in the public discourse. I think that responsibility is not being championed the way it used to be by the party. Let's look at the NGOisation crisis that has engulfed our society. NGOisation, of course, I'm not speaking with a first-year class. I'm fully much aware. People are aware of what NGOisation is. Basically, society being overwhelmed by the presence of NGOs. And NGOs grew mainly in the 1980s and the 1990s across the world. At least that's what they're acknowledging in India. But in South Africa, they started to grow massively in the post-2000 period. In other words, when South Africa began to embrace open markets and trade liberalization, one of the things that came into the borders of the country was the NGO sector, the NGO industry, the NGO industrial complex. You can see it during the 2000s through the HIV and AIDS campaign, the LGBTQI+ campaign, and many other related campaigns that were largely driven by the NGO sector. These NGOs largely have been anti-ANC in their operations, content and character, anti-SACP, anti-state, anti-black, anti-working class, you name them. And one of the key identifiable operations of this NGO industrial complex has been what I term the provision of sleeping tablets to genuine activism. We see many promising comrades and revolutionaries and activists being absorbed as labor of these NGOs. So these NGOs come funded by major corporations from the West, and they provide lucrative salaries to former activists and comrades who come from the movement, even those who come also from the student movement where I was based as well. So what has happened is, because one of the major challenges of this economy is lack of tangible employment for young people, many young comrades who come out of the student movement and the labor movement have been absorbed by the NGO sector, and their activism, therefore, has been given sleeping tablets. And what now this has done, it has made activism develop a form of a commodity. Activism now has become a form of a transaction towards a particular end. Because NGOs have financial years, They move from one refugee camp to another, from one crisis to another, in order to report how the funds of major corporations have been spent. So when the state tends to withdraw, NGOs come in to act as representatives of the people around that gap. And you'd find that most of the time, the crisis that major corporations have created in Africa, NGOs usually make a U-turn to come back to the very same Africa to provide aid and position themselves as entities that are better than the state to support the livelihoods of people. We often hear them coming through as well, sponsoring the views of xenophobic conflicts that take place in South Africa. But if you trace the crisis of migration in South Africa, at the core of it is the destruction of African societies, which have largely left South Africa more stable. And that is why many Africans, therefore, leave their countries and come to South Africa in search for a livelihood. But when those conflicts now begin to emerge in the form of skewed labor or employment opportunities creating patterns by capital, which largely favors cheap labor that comes from our neighboring countries, the NGO sector terms that conflict created by capital as a xenophobic tendency amongst Black people in South Africa and also in society. So the inner workings of NGOisation in society and how they inform the languages and the terms that we use in the movement are some of the aspects that need to be given careful attention and be provided with our traditions of critique as the party. I think, Prof, let me pause there for now. I will come back with the other remaining areas of my paper during the dialogue section. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Pedro. I think that's really interesting. It actually poses some additional questions to us. I want to close this live thing. I don't know how to do this. Can you close off this thing, the transcription? So Pedro, I think there are two parts to your talk which are really interesting. I mean, the one follows on from Gary and Lolonga's presentation, which is really the question of industrial policy, deindustrialization, and really what progress has been made in this regard through the SACP's influence in government. The second part on NGOisation I find quite fascinating, because I've never understood NGOs as being an economic actor in that sense, as an employer, as having some influence on people's activism and thinking through being an employer, although I'm familiar with that in the case of Zimbabwe. So if this is happening in South Africa as well, it's quite interesting. And it poses an interesting contrast to the notion of the problem that is one of employment in state agencies, that people are dependent on the state for employment. So you're really looking at the NGO, which is a sector which is funded as non-profit organizations, which are playing that role, creating dependency and control. I wonder if there are people who would like to respond. I want you to close the transcription, which I enabled because somebody requested it, but I'm finding it very distracting. The on-screen transcription. Thanks. Okay, so I'm going to take some questions and comments on both presentations and try and link them together. I'm wondering if Monga Peter, I see, is here, who's from the NGO sector, if he would have some response to that. And I wonder if other participants here will have a response to Lolonga's and Gary's findings. Maybe in particular people from the international arena. I see Irina Filatova is part of the meeting, and some of the influences of China and the USSR and their incorporation into the global capitalist economy, what influence that had on the SACP's ability to engage in any form of transition to socialism through the ANC government. But anyway, those are just suggestions. Lolonga,
I have my hand up.
Lolonga, oh, Devin has his hand up, and Lolonga also wants to ask a question. So Devin, let me take you first. Devin Pillay.
Hi, thanks, Janet. Just very two very quick points. On the first presentation, I look forward to seeing how this research develops, because you're only touching on the surface at the moment. But one point which you glossed over, and I think you should go back to look into, is at the moment when the GEAR emerged on the scene, the SACP actually supported it, which you don't mention. So I think you need to look into that, and then, of course, it shifted. COSATU opposed it immediately, but the SACP, in its public pronouncements, did not. And it'll be fascinating to understand what actually was going on in the SACP at the time and how it shifted its position. And my understanding is that some of the younger members of the SACP, who later became marginalized, as it were the ones pushing for a strong critique of GEAR and its neoliberal policies. On the question of NGOisation, I'm very worried about such a broad brushstroke analysis. I think we must be very, very wary, because it harks back to sort of conspiracy theory type thinking, which detracts from, I think, what could be an important critique to make about specific NGOs. You've got to name them. These broad brush, wiping off a whole swathe of organizations as NGOisation, as part of a NGO industrial complex, it sounds enticing, but it's very dangerous. So just putting everybody into one black hole of evil, basically. It's a Manetian, the SACP ANC is good, everybody else is evil. It's an analysis that I was hoping we've come away from in order for us to have deep understandings about the challenges facing our country. But to say that people who criticize the ANC, everybody's criticizing the ANC, even the ANC is criticizing the ANC now. So to just wipe people off as being anti-progress, anti-anything good, is very, very dangerous. Rather, say which specific NGOs are doing the things that you are saying, and do a critique of those specific NGOs. That's just something I'm very concerned about, and I think should be taken into account. Thanks.
Thanks, Devin. And maybe just as a follow-up, to look at specific NGOs, where the funding comes from, follow the money, who's funding those NGOs, and what is their agenda, which I think would be a useful approach. Let me ask, I've got Ilva, let me first ask Lolonga. I know you wanted to respond, and then I'll take Ilva. Lolonga, are you there?
Lolonga, you must unmute yourself.
Have I muted now? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I can hear you now.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I was just about to say some of the questions I would have asked have been covered by Devin, but one thing that I would love to ask to Mzileni Now that is, he mentioned quite a number of times the establishment of a state bank. Now, which harks back to what has been said more often about the Reserve Bank. Is he also advocating for the nationalization of the Reserve Bank? That's what I'd love to ask, because currently we do not have a state bank, and there have been some clamorings for the nationalization of the Reserve Bank. That's my question, whether he also advocates for that nationalization. Well, what Devon raised regarding the SACP, yes, indeed, since unfortunately, because we were trying to edit what we had written, the text, I think it's Hein Marais who mentions the fact that initially the SACP, yes, supported to a greater or lesser extent GIE, but later on towards the end of the year, in his book, I think, I do have it myself, I just look at the title, yeah, Limits to Change. The book Limits to Change, the first one he wrote before he wrote Pushed to the Limit. He does explain that Mbeki was able to go to some members of the SACP, amongst whom is Charles Nakula, who at the time was the chairperson of the SACP. And he also approached some members of COSATU, the former premier of Gauteng, his name is just slipping away from me, Mbazima Shilowa. Yeah, Mbazima Shilowa were some of the people that were approached by Mbeki when he did this, and they seem to have approved it, the GIE, because as Hein Marais puts it, it was shown to each of them before it went on to be shown to the rest of the party. Hence, there was this ambivalence, if I may put it, ambivalence on GIE. I think I've tried to answer it.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm sure we'll come back to this. I don't know if people want to respond on the question of the Reserve Bank. I'm sure there are other people here in the meeting who would like to respond to that.
Can I, Irina Filatova, I just, since you called me out, not about the Reserve Bank, but I just wanted to raise the question of practicability. You know, particularly in the 1990s, to speak about building socialism in the international atmosphere, and actually the composition of social forces, if we need to speak about it, in the 1990s was, I think, just totally unpracticable. That is why to demand that the Communist Party should or would go for something more radical than it did would be suicidal, more or less. Thank you.
Thank you, Irina. Let me come back to the other responses. Jeremy, I note your hand. I'm going to take Ilva McKay first. Ilva?
Thanks and good morning to everyone. Good day. Just to appreciate all the presentations that have been made up to now. And my comment was going to be around the input from the last speaker, who was Comrade Mzileni, and specifically around the issue of the NGOs, because I think from some of us, we believe that the building and the support for the NGOs, as well as the co-op movement, is something that has to be encouraged absolutely by us, those who are in political organizations and those who are in government, but especially that government needs to support such organizations because they become backbone to our communities. You have a range of NGOs that are functioning: women's support, soup kitchens, recycling, environmental. So I just think, yes, as Devon was saying earlier, there needs to be caution around the kind of criticism. And if there is fear about specific NGOs, then they should be outed. But I think as a general, that is something that we would want to support very, very strongly. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you, Ilva. I can see we're going to have some engagement about the NGO issue. Just in terms of the question of gear, I just wanted to also reflect on the book by Robbie van Niekerk and the late Vishnu Padayachi, which was called Shadow of Liberation, which went into some detail about who was consulted about gear or not. And I think it's quite interesting, this question about who precisely was involved in that. Maybe, Jeremy, I'm not sure if that's what you want to respond to, but let me take your response at this point.
Yeah, thanks, Janet, and also thanks to Gary and Lolonga and to Pedro. I think very fascinating issues have come up. There's 3 or 4 things I'd like to try and raise very briefly. It's obviously difficult to do justice to any of them. Just on the gear matter, yes, I think that Robbie and his co-writer, I think, get it right broadly, the explanation of what happened. I think it's very important to understand, and Devin was in a way touching on that. We mustn't think of the SACP as sort of this, it's a site of struggle as well, including at the leadership level of the SACP. So, and not least in that period of the mid-1990s when gear came into being. So the party's original position on gear was a kind of holding position, broadly, you know, accepting it. But over the next months, and Devin is quite right on this, there were extremely hot debates going on in the party, in the Central Committee and so on around it, eventually producing a much firmer and I think correct critique of the policy. In terms of Gary and Lolonga's approach to the NDP, I think also they're tending to see, I mean, first of all, when the NDP came out, the NUMSA in particular was extremely critical of it. So there was no unanimity within COSATU, for instance, and generally COSATU critiqued the National Development Plan. The party's position on it was that it was seriously flawed as a plan, and that remains the party's position, but warned against what we called monumentalizing it, turning it into a granite block of consistency, which it certainly isn't. It's a very mixed product. I mean, there's some excellent chapters in it, in my view, on the environmental issues, on spatial transformation and so forth. But the economic chapter, chapter 3, is still very heavily neoliberal and not really a clear break at all from here. So that would be how I would suggest that as Gary and Lolonga pursue their work on it and look at the party's perspective on the NDP, it's a much more nuanced perspective than I think that they were suggesting. But I do think that in parts it was an improvement on gear, so I agree with that. The on Pedro's fascinating inputs, we do have state banks. We've got a Development Bank of Southern Africa. We've got, I think it's 9, certainly several provincial owned banks, the most notorious of them being Itala Bank in KZN. The ambition of the party was always to look at Brazil and Bindes, their development bank, because that was what underpinned industrialization in Brazil very effectively, and we never really achieved that. So I think that I agree with Pedro that we've neglected the financial sector. The massive financialization of our economy is hugely problematic, and we needed to much more effectively use the state and state resources and financial resources to do that. So the BEE route, if you like, Pedro is partly right, which has been mainly to slot in black men and black women and women to some extent into existing white companies. But the other route has been to use state resources, including the PIC and to some extent the DBSA, in a way that is highly problematic, obviously plundering public resources in order to create a new, supposedly independent black bourgeoisie. On the NGOs, I tend to agree with what the critique that comrades have leveled against Pedro. I think Pedro is raising an important point. There are dangers in the NGO sector. of foreign funding and of, as he said, turning it into a transactional employment and having to answer to foreign funders around their agendas. And some of the dynamics and some of the turmoil that we're seeing in some of the NGOs currently has to do with those dynamics. But on the other hand, so-called NGOs, I'm not sure if they really were that. The Treatment Action Campaign, or Equal Education, for instance, achieved real social movement status. I think it would be wrong to think of them, and played a hugely important role. And I agree with Ilva that there are many other smaller NGOs on the ground doing amazing work, and they do deserve greater state support. So let me leave it at that, but really to appreciate, I think, the interesting and challenging questions that comrades are raising.
Right, thank you, Jeremy. And I think we're going to come back in the second session to the question of industrial policy and the support for industrial development or productive development, cooperatives and so on, which is an important debate. I'm just noting here Peter Lim's comment about the NGO issue, which is that there's a big difference between NGOs involved in grassroots issues and the wealthy philanthropic forces with direct political agendas. And just to note that this is well researched in the United States and Latin America. So thank you, Peter. The note here from Patrick Bond, which relates to the whole big question of the transition from 1990 and the context, the time in which South Africa's transition took place, and whether a transition to socialism would have been possible. He notes that the question of delinking, in Samira Min's term, from world capitalism, whether that would be possible, whether that was possible, whether it is possible, whether it is a really important one. And he notes here, if we did not delink from international capitalism's intellectual property on AIDS medicine to get generics, which are now provided free through the public sector, would life expectancy have risen from 52 to 65? If we had not bucked the Suez water privatization in Johannesburg and several other small towns, tossing out the French profiteers, would free basic water have been possible? If we had let international universities in to cream off wealthier students, as Kader Asmal was tempted to do, but then decided not to do, would we have had such a successful fees must fall, getting universal tertiary free education for children from working class families, insourcing poorly paid university workers? The global capitalist system's COVID-19 vaccine apartheid is just the most obvious reflection of why we need to consider practical application in a great many circuits of capital. I thank you, Patrick Bond. I'm not going to take responses to that now, but I think we're going to come back to that in the second session of this morning. And I think Patrick Brennan is going to make a contribution which will respond to that in some respects. So that should be interesting in terms of circuits of capital. And I think I'm just having a look. I don't see any other hands, any other contributions at this point. So I'm going to ask, actually, what are we, 20 past 11. I'm going to suggest that we end this session, this first half of the session, and have a short break, let's say a 10-minute comfort break, tea break, come back at 11:30 for Patrick and Jeremy Cronin's papers, and then we'll have some time for discussion after that. So thank you very much for the presenters so far. Okay. Thanks. Can you take off the welcome break schemes? Welcome break screen. Thanks. Great. I think we're all back. We can resume the seminar. So we've got two speakers on the next section of this panel. And the first is Patrick Brennan, who is a colleague of mine in the Department of Development Studies, who is involved with our Transition Township project. So he's going to be looking at industrial development from below, and he'll explain the concept, which I'm sure has intrigued you on the website, if you've seen it, of fully automated luxury communism, and whether we can achieve that and how, if so, how. And then after that, we will have Jeremy Cronin, who will be talking about the SACP's attempt to rethink the socialist struggle. So I think these two papers will go together and address some of the questions around industrial policy that were raised in the previous part of the seminar. And then we can start looking towards the future. So let's start with Patrick. Yeah, I think Patrick's screen is shared, so you can go ahead, Patrick.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Can everyone hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, I'm just going to turn on that.
And we like your image as well.
Okay. Right, you can see me as well, I presume. Good morning, everyone, again. So what we're going to do is talk about whether or not it's possible to build some kind of alternative from below in the current situation. And so, and people are probably familiar with these points, but just to reiterate, the manifestations of what is really a global meta crisis, ecological destruction, climate change, mass unemployment, gig economy, supply chains are being disrupted, the issues around inflation, there's rising geopolitical tensions in all kinds of places, crises of political legitimacy, all of which exacerbated by the COVID emergency. And part of what's going on is that we are in the sort of crisis point of one of the Kondratiev cycles. And I'm not going to go through the detail of this, but essentially over the last sort of 300 years, there have been people debate how many of them there have been, but between 4 and 5. And what seems to be going on is that we are moving through a period of technological change where not only does technology change, but also capitalism itself transforms itself from one form to another. And again, I'm not going to go into detail of this, but just to make the point that during this period, these periods of crises, the technologies that become available set up the new production system. And at that period of a next upswing, that's when these technologies become sort of ubiquitous. And what's going on is an exponential growth in all kinds of areas, but particularly if you look at the amount of data that's available for processing in various different kinds of production systems, we're on some kind of exponential growth. And that has implications for what we'll be able to do. So what is capital up to? We see the emergence of global corporate power that's in many ways anti-democratic. Things like, surveillance capitalism, the sort of idea of neo-feudalism that we see in things like the gig economy, artificial intelligence, the fourth industrial revolution, the review emerges to some kind of ideology. So where you have people like Jeff Bezos who tweet about gay rights, but don't ask questions about what's going on with Amazon workers. Things like the Green New Deal, shifts to renewable energy, COP26, maybe the end of austerity in some sense in the West, basic grants, geopolitical changes, and then in South Africa those things all resonate. So we have, you know, this just energy transition, this 130 billion rand that's going to be supposedly made available. There's debates around the basic income grants. There's issues around how the gig economy manifests itself. But our national discourse doesn't tend to address these things directly. It's more focused on how do we manage the existing situation, corruption, gender-based violence, black empowerment, etc. But what seems to be going on is there's some kind of reset going on in the global economy. And that revolves around new production and communication technologies, decentralized and relocalized production and supply chains, and potentially the mass ownership of productive assets. But for example, market analysts are predicting that parts of the economy are going to take off like a rocket ship. So to kind of unpack this a little bit, we're going back to Marx. This is what Marx lays out in Capital Volume 1. David Harvey does a very good analysis of this, and I recommend it to everybody. But this comes from him, and it kind of describes what we all kind of know about the economy. You know, people can see my. Can you see my cursor here? Yeah. So the capitalist enters into the day with money, buys some commodities, the means of production and labor power, produce some kind of commodity that manifests in wage goods, luxury goods, means of production, and then eventually is realized in some sort of money form. And then what happens to the money, what we've been kind of concerned about for the last, let's say, the last century. You know, how much taxes, what's the industrial profit, what are merchants doing, where is the rent going, that kind of thing. And then how does the state intervene in, you know, in demand and in the economy and the reproduction of the labor market, let's say. That's volume 1 of Capital. Volume 2 is more focused on sort of an abstraction of the production process itself, and the idea that capital is actually value in motion. And so what happens is we go from resources to the production process into commodity, and in the process there's a transformation that happens between money to a commodity, which is the labor power or means of production. That then goes into a production process and produces a new commodity, which is then translated into new value of money. And those form a circuit. So money gets transformed over time, over the production process back into money. That's the financial capital circuit. But similarly, there is a production or industrial capital circuit where production transforms into production. And the same thing applies to commodity, where commodity transforms into commodity. And there's a circulation of capital in each of those spheres. And what's going on is that, okay, so firstly, there's a danger of, and over time, there's phases where different kinds of capital dominate. So at the moment, one could argue that financial capital is dominating. But maybe a previous period in the 20th century, it might have been more production capital that was dominating. And what's happening is that money, labor markets, commodity markets, and production systems, which all precede capitalism, are essentially transformed over time through some sort of process of co-evolutionary transformation, which creates and carries on the social relation of the extraction of surplus value. Communism would not necessarily abolish, but would rather seek to transform these circuits, if you want to call it that. And the question then becomes, what are we transforming them into? And there's a long history of attempts to answer this question. So the Paris Commune, labor exchange in the 19th century, there's cooperatives, Red Vienna, various experiments that are various degrees of success, including Mondragon in Spain, and Argentinians cooperatives since the Argentine crisis. They all run into problems when they have to interact with the broader system. What we need to be thinking about is how is capital itself evolving the system itself, and whether it's possible for us to interact with that evolution. So David Harvey talks about activity spheres through which capital actually evolves. Technological and organizational forms, social relations, institutional and administrative arrangements, production and labor processes, relations to nature, the reproduction of daily life, and then mental conceptions of the world. So we would not necessarily be abolishing those spheres, but can we democratize them, becomes a question. And what we've been thinking about at the university is, is it possible to kind of look at what would a 21st century alternative look like, and can it be built here? So the things that we've come up with would be that it had to be democratic, participatory, and inclusive, leave nobody behind, decentralized and solve problems where they occur, mobilize the resources of the nation, deploy existing capability and infrastructure of the state and civil society, solve the problems we face, build neighborhoods fit for people to live in, and repurpose the existing brownfield industrial plants and infrastructure, and including our infrastructure. And the question then becomes, is it possible to create a mass-based ownership of some kind of means of production? And we've looked at this in NG in particular, and the pilot project that we did in KwaZulu took a small piece of municipal land, some labor, some plant and machinery. If we invest R1 million, we would have an installation that could produce around about 150,000 kilowatts per annum, which is around about market value of around about 280,000 rand. So that would then provide us with some kind of interaction with these circuits of capital, so finance, industrial, and merchant capital, because we are producing a product that can be sold in a market, that can be financed. And the question is, how would we go about doing that? This is the result of that pilot project, a 5 kilowatt installation produced over approximately a year. Top here, around about 7.5 megawatt hours, which is 15,000 rand on, and it's the kind of installation that could fit on a RDP house. It's not that much bigger than it's around about the size of a small carport. And so that has implications. You can, if you did that at scale, you would be involving suppliers of labor, of equipment, of various other different kinds of services. You would have a installation on the household or a chain installation larger than that. At the scale of KwaZulu, that would be 100 megawatts. And produce 150 gigawatt hours, which, and I'll show you now, at current prices, that's significant. So we anticipate that if every household in the country participated in something like this, and we're not saying that we should do that, but just show you what could be done at scale, we would have 120% of the current installed capacity of Eskom, and 83% of its planned capacity. That would mean the rand value of production for the township would be around about 285 million, which again is not insignificant at all, especially when you consider that township currently consumes around about 45 million rand of electricity and 50 million. So that's that's production. That's an example of how you could democratize production of one thing, which is a kilowatt hour. But what happens when you get to the concept of machines being smart enough to become workers? In other words, when capital effect becomes a, and the question was famously asked of Henry Ford, who will buy the cars if the robots are making the cars? And to think about this, you think about the music industry, where you know, in the 1980s, if you were making an album, you would have to actually manufacture the album and distribute it to a record store. There would be costs of packaging of the actual record itself, etc. Whereas these days, if you want to release a single or even an album, you just put it on YouTube or Spotify. The cost of actually producing one more copy of the album is close enough to zero as to be, for the purpose of our discussion, effectively zero. And so what happens is that you produce the album and then it gets released, and the cost of it, the cost of listening to it tends towards zero. So some people pay a small amount, others will actually download it for free. So what does that mean when we're talking about doing that kind of thing in almost all kinds of production? You know, does it mean the decommodification of wage goods and the reproduction of daily life? Does it mean that we can actually have an economy of abundance where we're able to use the material around us, possibly a lot of recycled, to actually meet the needs of our people? And people have been talking about, you know, that what would that mean? It would mean some kind of fully automated luxury communism. And a way of sort of understanding that is to look at some of the, you know, the Soviet era science fiction, where, for example, somebody goes off to Mars and sees a perfect communist society where the robots do all the work and the Martians simply look after the robots. And you know, there's no money, because there's no need for money, because you don't have to pay anybody to buy anything, because everything is produced on demand. And the question then becomes, who owns the robots? So what we are arguing is that the space exists for worker and community-owned production systems to be built now alongside and inside the present system, using existing space that's in the urban environment, and possibly, you know, brownfield industrial space. For example, in Kwazakele, we've got a large power station which is currently being used as a manganese dumper, which could easily be but with proper intervention, could be transformed into some kind of, you know, 21st century production center for various different things. And kind of what we're saying is that the way to do this is to go back to street committees and to organize them around economic activities, and for them to be taking in their immediate space, taking control of as much production as they possibly can. So whether it's food production, which is also going on, or recycling, or energy, those things should all be happening. And then in space that's available, in brownfield space that can be transformed into more sort of sophisticated production, we can look at things like 3D printing and that kind of thing. More sort of advanced is a sort of technological you know, journey on which people can be taken. And we're saying also that there's a role for local commerce and industry and, you know, government in setting all this up. In a way, we're kind of saying there's a potential overlap in interest between what we're trying to do and what some of the, let's say, local bourgeoisie is interested in. So, for example, you know, the way in which global corporations are putting pressure on local industry creates some kind of potential common interest, let's say. And the other thing is that potentially we should be arguing for free markets, because that's not what capital is arguing for. Capital is actually, it's might be controversial, but capital is actually arguing for monopolized markets. We should be arguing for the opening up of markets to everybody, in other words, to these cooperatives and also to their potential allies in local industry. So I'll just leave you with some quotes here. The first is from Aristotle. There's only one condition in which we can imagine managers not needing subordinates and masters not needing slaves. This condition would be that each instrument could do its own work at the word of command or by intelligent anticipation, like the statues of Deleuze or the tripods made by Hephaestus, of which Homer relates that of their own motion they entered the conclave of the gods on Olympus, as a shuttle would weave of itself and a plectrum should do its own hoppling. And then from Karl Marx, in a communist society where nobody has one exclusive sphere of activity, but each can become accomplished in any branch he wishes, society regulates the general production and thus makes it possible for me to do one thing today and another tomorrow, to hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner, just as I have a mind, without ever becoming a hunter, fisherman, herdsman, or critic. And then Warren Buffett, if you don't find a way to make money while you sleep, you will work till you die. And then finally from Vladimir Lenin, communism is Soviet power plus the electrification of the whole country. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you, Patrick, and thanks for keeping absolutely to time, getting a lot into the presentation. I think I just want to encourage people to stay with us for this afternoon session, because we're going to have Devin Pillay and Sid Luckett, who are going to be talking about eco-socialism. And it also relates to this question about whether technological advance or advances in the forces of production can result in socialized ownership or a socialist economy. Are we at that point where this is a real possibility? I also just wondered, in relation to the Transition Township project, whether, Pedro, that is a response, or whether it meets your challenge of how we could possibly be putting into place productive systems, productive economies in townships which are owned by the people who live there. Whether that is a real possibility, and also whether we can respond to Patrick Bond's challenge about whether this actually is a delinking from capitalism, or whether it's trying to build socialism within an existing capitalist system, which is quite resistant to democratization. So I think there's a lot of challenges in that presentation. Are there any immediate questions to Patrick from participants? Patrick, maybe you can stop sharing your screen. And I can see if anybody wants to raise anything. Mareka, do you want to ask something?
Thank you, Prof. And thank you, Patrick, for that presentation. Yes, Prof. Actually, I made a note when Patrick was going through his presentation to respond to Pedro's point earlier regarding, revitalizing, our township areas. And definitely, I think this localized economic development does speak to that. But at the same time, I think it's quite clear that I think with our experience when it comes to, the Transition Township project, and also, working with cooperatives, there are constraints in terms of involvement as well of communities themselves, just based on, what the speakers have already been said, where communities are really struggling with high unemployment. And, projects like this, as much as they are aimed at really turning them or turning our communities into prosumers instead of consumers. At the end of the day, you know, we still live in a society that is highly controlled by capitalism, you know, and where whatever it is that you need, you know, you need to put capital in. And yeah, I think such constraints are still there. And I think with this project, at some point, you know, we'll find a model that actually works as we pilot into different areas and as we proceed with this. Thank you very much. I think I've made several points, but I will leave it here. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that response. I think we're going to come back after Jeremy's presentation to have some debate about these issues, especially the viability of cooperatives, which I think is an important question for us at the moment. And we'll also focus a little bit on the solidarity economy and that concept. Where does it fit into this transitional scenario or transition to socialism? Okay, I don't see other hands now, so I'm going to go on to our final speaker for this morning session, and that is Jeremy Cronin. So Jeremy Cronin, I think you are familiar with him. I'm going to introduce him as a public intellectual, South African Communist Party leader. He joined the South African Communist Party in 1968, which is a very long time ago. And he's also, as you'll be familiar with him, he's an ANC leader who served for 20 years in the cabinet from 2009 to, no, that's 10 years, 20 years. Oh,
10 years.
10 years.
Yeah.
10 years.
Less guilty than your friend.
Yeah, more than 20 years in government, but in cabinet, 10 years in cabinet from 2009 to 2019. So yeah, he has experience both as an activist and as and from the side of the state, should we say. So yeah, Jeremy, over to you.
Thanks very much, Janet, and also thanks to Patrick for the last input, which is fascinating. Let me try and share screen. I'm not very good at doing it, but I think I'm going to do it. Has it come up successfully?
It's coming. Yeah, there we go. It's there.
Okay, great. Okay. So the title is Socialism, the Future, Build It Now or Build It Then. Okay. So I want to begin with reflecting on what got formalized as Marxism-Leninism, I think during the Soviet period, basically in the 30s. Was basically the view of a kind of historical linearity, that history proceeded along stages, with one stage following the next and each one being more advanced. And the idea that socialism, unlike capitalism, couldn't emerge, as was said, in the so-called interstices, in the belly of the old. And the argument being that socialism had to be consciously planned as opposed to something that could emerge or more or less organically as capitalism did in the older modes of production. Which meant that there had to be a revolutionary break, a capture of state power by the proletariat first, and only then, in this a new stage, as it were, could socialism be constructed, so to speak, in a new time zone and a new space and so forth. And this notion of the break, of the revolutionary break, was of course the basis of the binary that developed through the 20th century, a problematic one in my view, between parties that characterized themselves as communist, as revolutionary, and those that were dismissed as reformist, typically Labour or social democratic parties, each with their own strengths and weaknesses, it should be said. It's important to remember that this view of the kind of necessity of an absolute revolutionary break before you could think about beginning to make socialism had been challenged from within the communist movement, notably by Gramsci, obviously writing in a fascist prison in the 1930s. His work, unfortunately, only became available generally publicly in the 50s and 60s and so on. But basically, his idea was that on the terrain of capitalism itself, a war of position needed to be waged for socialist hegemony in all the trenches of a capitalist society, within the state, within trade unions, within the broader society, on the land, in the education system, and so forth. But returning to the kind of what got canonized as Marxism-Leninism, often with a very small pair of scissors, cutting out some of Marx and some of Lenin and turning it into Marxism-Leninism, the argument was that a revolutionary break would be possible and inevitable, basically, because of capitalism's inherent tendency to crisis. Now we know, and some of what Patrick was saying historically, is that modern capitalism over the last 200 years at least has shown a remarkable ability to and resilience to overcome its crises, whether we're talking about the Great Depression of the 30s, basically, of stagflation and the oil price shock of 1973, the Great Recession more recently of 2008 going forward, and so on. And basically capitalism has the ability of turning crises of capitalism in, and not making them crises for capitalism, or at least they crises for capitalism temporarily, but it manages to surpass them through world wars, through the mass destruction of productive plant, and basically by loading its crises onto the third world, onto popular classes, onto the environment, and so forth. Okay, so this kind of stagism, which I think is very problematic and still informs a lot of thinking in the South African broad movement, came to South Africa with the famous 1928 Comintern resolution on South Africa, which urged, in fact instructed, the Communist Party of South Africa that the immediate struggle was for a Black Republic, or Native Republic as it called it there, as a stage towards a workers' and peasants' republics. The notion of a national democratic revolution, although those words weren't used, but that's what, you know, essentially was in formation, that idea, was present from 1928 as a stage of struggle. And the Communist Party was told to work with the ANC, much against the inclinations of the Communist Party at that stage, which regarded the ANC as a rather genteel organization. It was advised to work with the ANC and in it to transform it into a fighting anti-imperialist nationalist movement. And this gave to what was essentially a two-stage strategic paradigm that I think dominated the party's broad strategic thinking up until the early 1990s, really, in varying degrees. Namely, that there first needed to be a national democratic revolution and then a socialist revolution to be followed. Now, for much of the non-SACP left, this resolution of 1928 and the continued strategic practice that was informed it was basically the original sin, the Stalinism, if you like, of the Communist Party in South Africa, a grievous error in forming an alliance with what was always going to be a bourgeois-inclined ANC. Okay, now, what I'm going to be advancing was that I think the problem was not with the strategy of a national democratic revolution against white minority rule, for majority rule, and so forth. The problem was with the stagism, which was, I think, incorrectly linked into the notion of a national democratic revolution. And interestingly, even in the late 1920s, at the time, in fact, S.B. Bunting, one of the founder leaders of the Communist Party, traveling back from the 1928 Comintern conference, wrote a letter saying, the language about stages, he said, was, you know, shouldn't be understood as a chronological notion of one stage following another. They were more like sociological categories, he said. And he went on to say the notion of a stage is simply verbiage. Trotsky, interestingly, in a letter written to his local followers here in South Africa, Fourth Internationalists, as they described themselves, also, interestingly, advised them to support the idea of a national democratic line. But at the same time, Trotsky, I think, correctly criticized the stagism that had been attached to it. And he advanced instead the idea of an uninterrupted revolution. Okay, so much for a very quick and rather over brief historical summary. So 1990, a new epoch, and already Gary, Lolonga, and others have talked about this. Where we, as we approached the abolition of, formal abolition of apartheid in South Africa, what was the global epoch in which we found ourselves? End of history, as Fukuyama famously described it, post-communism, as Tom Lodge in his brilliant book on the history of the 100 years of the South African Communist Party describes it. Well, the first point I want to make is that through the late 1970s and into 1990, saw the unraveling, yes, of the Soviet bloc of so-called East European, if you like, socialism. But it was not just that potentially progressive advance that was unraveled. In fact, the three post-1945 historic compromises, to use Samira Min's wonderful characterization, that were imposed on capitalism after the defeat of fascism at the end of the Second World War, namely an expanded Soviet bloc, so it had now grown beyond the Soviet Union, and therefore restricted the space available to an expansive capitalism, but also importantly, social democratic welfare states in many of the developed capitalist societies. Social contracts, social accords were imposed on war-torn, damaged national capitals in much of Western Europe, for instance. And then, of course, also the decolonization process, which gets underway firmly in Africa, but also in Asia and elsewhere in this post-1945 period. Now, these are three, unfortunately, temporary historic compromises, with all of which had progressive potential, were rolled back from the late 1970s to 1990. There were internal mistakes on all of them, a tendency to be excessively state-centric in their approaches to whether it was to welfare or to the building of socialism or to post-colonial advances. But essentially what rolled them back was the advance of a global financialized capital, aka neoliberalism, which succeeded in out-competing an increasingly stagnant Soviet Union, which was stuck in heavy industrialization and an extremely bureaucratic statusism. The Soviet Union was able to send up a Sputnik or manned personed orbits around the world ahead of the United States, but on the ground, there were bread queues, so unable to address consumer needs and so forth. But also what happened from the late 1970s and early 1980s is that is increasingly the social accords in developed capitalist countries were undermined. Thatcher, Reagan launched huge offensives against the trade union movements, and capital, British capital, Swedish capital, Italian capital, German capital, and so on, now recovered from war-torn ruin, broke with the social accords and disinvested in pursuit of low-wage markets elsewhere, not least in China, but also in other parts of the world as well. And of course, the newly independent post-colonial societies, not least in Africa, were some of whom showed significant progressive possibilities in Mozambique, important gains in literacy, healthcare, education, Zimbabwe as well. Angola, never given a chance with civil wars and so forth. But essentially, the potential for serious transformation in much of the formerly decolonized world was strangled in debt and structural adjustment programs. So this is the reality that both the ANC and SACP found themselves in with the approach of the negotiations and the serious possibility of a post-apartheid South Africa. So to understand the history, which some of the speakers have already been talking about the SACP in 1990, party confronted an extremely paradoxical reality. Irina also, I think, referred to that in passing briefly in her comments. So after 40 years of illegality, the party in 1990 finds itself with the key reference point that it had used, a sort of the magnetic center to which the North Pole to which it referred to was the Soviet Union. It was now unraveling rapidly. And in these conditions, half of the Central Committee, which had been elected just a few months before at the Seventh Party Congress in Cuba, quietly left the party without consulting the remaining parts of the party. This included some of the leading intellectuals who played an important role in the Communist Party, someone like Jules Netshitenzhe and Mbeki, Thabo Mbeki himself, and also therefore two future national presidents, Mbeki and Jacob Zuma, all of whom quietly disappeared from the party at this point. But on the other hand, the SACP's national popularity and, of course, therefore, presumably the expectations of it were greater than at any time previously in its history. There was something like 40,000 plus attendance at the July 1990 coming out rally in Soweto. There was a five-fold increase in party membership at the July 1991 Congress. Chris Hani, according to opinion polls, independent ones at the time, said that he was easily the second most popular politician in South Africa, obviously after Nelson Mandela. So in this context, from 1993, on the eve of approaching elections, the SACP began to advance the slogan, "Socialism is the future, but build it now." And what the party sought to explain in that particular issue of the AC, where the slogan was first used publicly, was that there was a continued commitment to the National Democratic Revolution and to an ANC-led alliance, but the SSP was saying that our intentions were not merely to be a passenger, a staff rider, as it were, hitchhiker on an ANC electoral success and so on, waiting for our time to come, some, future capitalist crisis, and then we would unfurl red flags and create a socialist revolution. I'm not sure what was going to happen to the ANC, whether we'd send them off to South African Siberia or not, I'm not sure, but anyhow. But the intention was to campaign for socialism on the terrain of a post-apartheid South Africa. And this required the progressive advanced consolidation, the National Democratic Revolution itself, in order to be advanced, to be consolidated, and to be defended in a post-apartheid reality, would require, the party was now arguing, a strong socialist orientation. And this meant building momentum towards, capacity for, and elements of socialism in the present. So let me unpack those three: momentum, capacity, and elements of very briefly, just in sort of headline terms. First of all, the idea that the struggle for socialism in the present, on the terrain of hopefully a deepening national democratic revolution, would be a struggle for reforms, yes, not a revolutionary break, but they would need to be revolutionary reforms. I think that term we borrowed from Boris Kagalitsky, who in Russia was arguing for something similar at the time. In other words, they needed to be reforms, but with a structurally transformative and cumulative impact as much as possible, as opposed, for instance, to reforms that would simply consolidate the underlying structural deformities. As Pedro put it nicely, the kind of include blacks in white-dominated, white-managed, white-owned companies through the BE route doesn't change anything. The big question, and the party asked it openly, was, do blacks in the boardroom change the boardroom, or does the boardroom change the blacks? Well, by and large, I think the evidence is the latter. But also, another example would be reforms, but which are not transformative, which might even be problematic. For instance, one of the arguably great achievements on the one hand of the RDP was some 3 million low-cost houses built, not very well often, and often through corruption of all kinds, but nonetheless built. But where were they built? On the distant semi-periphery of towns and cities, which reproduced simply the dormitory township, daily migrancy crisis of social reproduction that had deepened in the apartheid period. On the left there is apartheid era housing development, matchbox houses in Soweto. On the right is, I'm afraid to say, ANC government-led RDP housing on the East Rand. Spot the difference. Well, the difference is probably the ones on the right are slightly less well-built and less durable, more packed together and so forth, and then resulting in all of the crises of daily migrancy that we can see in the slide below. Okay, so momentum towards capacity for socialism. Now, I want to underline, and I'm not sure if we're not locked Janet into a little bit of a two-stage theory where this half of the webinar is meant to be talking about the state, and the other half is meant to be talking about, because the capacity for socialism, as the party's been saying, needs to be built both within society and in the state. So struggles in the trenches of both of those places. And we need to understand, the party's been saying, both society and popular classes and the state as co-producers of transformation and of socialism. And this capacity includes, and here comes another version of Patrick Bond's point about delinking. So critically, we need to have to build as much as possible, both through popular power as well as through effective and well-directed state, a well-directed state, the relative national sovereignty of our country, so that we are able, for instance, to challenge what's called national vaccine nationalism, which should really be called vaccine imperialism. So versus the post-colonial independence that typically gets hollowed out. So you can have multi-party elections in a post-colonial situation, but the real decisions get made by the IMF, World Bank, ratings agencies, and so on. Clearly a massive danger that we face today. And we've really got to build a more effective national sovereign capacity. It's never going to be absolute, but certainly we need to, as much as possible, de-link ourselves from the so-called value chains, which are really vacuum hoovering surplus out of third world countries, including our own. We need an effective civil service, not a tendering or procuring state. And we need effective public or social ownership, and not just the formality of state ownership. We need vibrant institutions of participatory democracy. So earlier when we were talking about the RDP, I think one of the contributions of the party, but not just the party, comrades emerging from social, civic, and other struggles of the 1980s, an important element in the RDP is a strong stress on building participatory democracy. But I think that we've got big challenges. I don't have the time to talk about that on that front, but school governing bodies, community policing forums, all of those are, ward committees and so on, were intended to assist for a flourishing participatory democratic institutions and not just have representative electoral democracy. Strong trade unions, yes, mass democratic formations, community formations, and so on. And then critically also, capacity for socialism means sustainable livelihoods for the overwhelming majority of working class, poor, marginalized, precariat, the precariat more broadly. And that's where the struggle currently, which is an important struggle for a universal basic income grant, is so important. It's not about welfare. It's about ensuring that people, I saw there was a lovely comment about COP26 where someone said, we're talking about the end of the world, but for the majority of the world's population, getting to the end of the month is a huge uncertainty. So we need also socially and environmentally safe neighborhoods. So the kinds of projects that the Transition Project from Nelson Mandela University is looking at is an important aspect of that. Against the lived situation in which we've got now, in which there's this massive demoralization, dysfunctionality in many of our communities as a result of mass unemployment, of time-consuming daily migrancy for those who do have some work or are looking for work. I mean, we have 2 to 3 hour commutes. It would be interesting for someone with more academic resources than I do to find out whether other countries that imposed curfews in the course of the COVID pandemic, whether their curfews end at 4 a.m. in the morning. I mean, that's telling us something about the lived conditions of workers in South Africa, that in order to get to work from distant townships in terrible public transport, we have to lift the curfew at 4 a.m. in the morning, of workers and poor standing in endless queues, of rural patriarchy and former Bantustans and so on. All of those things are undermining the popular capacity to drive a people-driven process of transformation. And then critically, the parties also talked about elements of socialism. So And this would involve, for instance, building in the present as much as possible the progressive decommodification, or if you like, the delinking from the capitalist market, decommodification of basic human needs, whether it's water, food, housing, healthcare, education, childcare, mobility and access, and so on. But also critically, the decommodification of work, this notion that the only real work is the work for a capitalist boss. We've got to demystify this notion that public sector employment there's something wrong or problematic about it. And we certainly need to champion, as I did when I was a deputy minister very strongly, mass public employment and community work programs. And generally, to call for what the Freedom Charter does call for, the right to work, and with the state as the employer of last resort. And then, of course, critically, and these will be important subjects for this afternoon, co-ops, solidarity, it's broader solidarity economy, and that. All of those are building elements of a different kind of economy, a different kind of political economy, a non-capitalist economy. All, of course, challenged by having to struggle for space and breathing space in a capitalist world. Now, that from at least 1993 and consistently until the present is the party's broad long-term vision of what we want to achieve. But of course, very quickly, it became apparent that within the broader ANC alliance, there were at least two very contrasting, I mean, to be a bit formulaic, two contrasting national democratic revolutionary strategic agendas. And one way of representing them as briefly as I can were foretold in the official reactions of the SACP and the ANC to the 1994 democratic breakthrough. So on the left is the May 1994 issue of the African Communist, which said "A luta continua," saying that people participated en masse in an election process, but democracy is more than just about democratization, and transformation is more than just about every 5 years or whatever voting in electoral process. The ANC's official publication at that time, Mayabui, I don't know how clear it is, had a very different take. Okay, and it basically is a picture of Impala jets flying over union buildings with a new flag, and a free at last proclamation, and then tiny underneath it says exclusive interview with State President Nelson Mandela, not exclusive interview with Comrade Mandela. So you can see a very state-centric version, and the imagination that the ANC was now in power in some kind of uncomplicated way. And the editorial incidentally goes on to say, basically a luta discontinua. People, kind of wait delivery, essentially, a kind of top-down delivery. So let me just very quickly, and I'm sure this is not so legible, but anyhow, basically this what we call the 1996 class project, referring obviously to the GEAR, and the intellectuals in the party who had framed that Mayabui cover and perspective were very much behind the 1996 class project and GEAR. Basically, they mistook the very positive global reception for South Africa's negotiated and so-called peaceful, it wasn't peaceful, as we all know, violence surged during the period, and Mandela's iconic stature for some kind of international commitment to Marshall Aid style to fund a post-apartheid reconstruction and development, as if South Africa was in Western Europe and the timeline was 1945. It also mistook this agenda, the support of South African monopoly capital for negotiated political transition, which there was. We know that the Anglos and others, urged the National Party to negotiate with the ANC and so on, but mistook this for an indication that South African monopoly capital was lined up post the political constitutional accord to also agree to investing through higher taxes, through investing in the South African economy productively. In fact, what they wanted out of the negotiations was an end to a formal end to apartheid and the lifting of sanctions so that they could pursue globalized disinvestment out of the country, which is exactly what's happened. There's been a massive, massive outflow of capital, both legal and illegal, out of the country. Monopoly capital, both international as well as local, paid lip service to the redistributive objectives of the RDP, X number of houses, welfare, and so forth, but argued that it could only be delivered, their word, if exchange controls were removed, if tariffs and company taxes were slashed, and so on. In short, if neoliberal shock therapy was imposed. And this duly came, as we know, with the 1996 gear package. And as others have already said, this resulted in growth of some kind, but in labor shedding and deindustrializing growth. But what concealed the structural problems in this path dependency that was deepened and consolidated was, of course, the massive global commodity super cycle, largely driven by Chinese industrialization, which provided a fiscal surplus to the ANC state, which enabled a not insignificant redistributive program, the 3 million RDP houses, a massive expansion, an important expansion of social grants and so on, until, of course, 2011, with the end of the commodity super cycle, which then exposed all of the underlying and untransformed structural flaws and the continued, problematic path dependency, which continues to reproduce all the crises of underdevelopment in our country. Now, behind this 1996 class project, there were a series of political assumptions. So here are ex-communist intellectuals, not least Mbeki himself, picking up on the old Marxist-Leninist stagism and defining the NDR, the National Democratic Revolution, as a stage. But it's now a stage because it's obviously not a socialist stage, according to them. It would need to be a stage in which capitalism in South Africa was basically normalized, i.e. whatever that means, but essentially what it meant was deracialized, so that the boardrooms, the demographic of boardrooms, the demographic of JSE's shareholding and so forth would be changed. So South Africa would become a capitalist liberal democracy, and that it would be consolidated as such. And it also involved, and here I'm picking up a bit with Pedro and also a bit with Patrick Bond's point about delinking. It became a politics of what we might call representative inclusion. So South Africa we were told that we were returning to the family of nations, as if imperialism had disappeared and there was this happy family of nations out there. And because we had this successful negotiated settlement, we were now returning to the bosom of the happy family, the family bride place, as it were. And we could host the World Cup and we could rejoin the Olympic Games and all of those things. There was also the belief that it was now the turn for Africa as a continent to have its renaissance. So again, here we see the old sort of so-called Marxism-Leninist linearity that, during the Mbeki presidency, the idea was that all continents get to have their renaissance. Some are just a little bit slower on the ladder than others, but Africa would, now it was Africa's turn. I'm not sure that Latin America ever had its renaissance, but anyhow, you can leave it as that. There was also the notion that there was to explain the continued existence of massive poverty, inequality, and so on. The argument was we've got a very good functioning first economy, a curious notion, but there's this laggard second economy, which just needed to be promoted into inclusion in the first economy. And critically also that Black economic empowerment needed to create a Black patriotic bourgeoisie, a kind of representative inclusion, what in poetics we call a synecdoche, where a part represents the whole. So it wasn't Black economic empowerment, it was elite empowerment for a few ANC-connected individuals by and large. Now, I mean, the mistake behind this and the whole dialectics of the reality in which we live got lost, as if South Africa had not always been included from the very beginning, from the early 20th century, if you like, in imperialist-dominated circuits of surplus extraction, as if Africa's plight was the product, of exclusion, as if somehow, people had forgotten about Africa, rather than Africa's massive underdevelopment was a result of an enforced inclusion into global surplus extraction through the slave trade, colonial plantations, extractive mining, unequal trade, debt peonage, etc. As if the so-called second economy minibuses could be recapitalized, and eureka, hallelujah, they would then be propelled into the first economy along with their customers out of their precarious third world reality. And as if white minority rule had simply been about the exclusion of the black majority and not also their simultaneous but grossly unequal inclusion as cheap migrant labor, whether annual migrant labor from the reserves or daily migrancy out of, dormitory townships, as expropriated dependence on white-owned retail networks, as the patriotically oppressed reproducers of a reserve army of labor. So it's a dialectic of inclusion and exclusion, and not just inclusion into the reality. Okay. So this project, and I'm spending a bit of time on it because to understand where the party is and the battles that have been fought, it's necessary to understand also a counter project, essentially. Organizationally, it sought to transform the ANC into a kind of third way social democracy. And Mbeki in particular was very influenced by Blair, Clinton, and Gerhard Schröder from Germany and so forth. And basically try to frame the ANC as an electoral party, supposedly social democratic, but it was a kind of neoliberalism with a redistributive conscience. They also sought to change or at least rebalance the class composition of the ANC itself. So we need to understand BE promotion, not just about promoting some individuals, but also changing the ethos, morality of the ANC itself amongst key leadership within the ANC. A former deputy president said, go forth and get filthy rich. However, this BE process, which involved necessarily, because capitalists without capital need to acquire capital from somewhere, and this can only come from one or another form of primary or primitive accumulation, using the state to regulate share allocation to the politically connected, or through public procurement processes, has resulted in, well, state capture, essentially. Compradorist stratum, very kind of fronting for, dominant monopoly capital, and parasitic strata of all kinds. And this process has created havoc inside of the ANC and within the movement broadly. And it's a challenge we're sitting with as we speak. Finally, last one, and the SACP. Okay. So strategically and programmatically, the party still continues to affirm the perspective that I tried to map out earlier of a radical national democratic revolution. And what would make it radical would be delinking in various ways, decommodification, delinking from imperialist so-called value change. It needed to be, in order to be an effective national democratic revolution, it would need to have an increasing socialist orientation. But organizationally and practically, there are challenges and disconnections within the party. So there is a programmatic vision of this kind, but organizationally and practically, therefore, the party doesn't necessarily have the capacity, for various reasons, which we can talk about more, to drive this agenda as effectively as we would want. So if one looks, for instance, at Tom Lodge's, as I said earlier, wonderful history, 100-year history of the Communist Party in South Africa, he identifies, and I think quite correctly, two major periods of very significant and by and large progressive influence of the Communist Party on the broad struggle in South Africa. The one was from 1945 through to the 1950s. And basically through the 30s and 40s, the Communist Party had built up a leadership that was rooted very strongly in trade unions and social movement struggles, in the cooperative movement, organizing in hostels, organizing on the land, less successfully, but nonetheless also there as well. And it was this cadreship, which was a non-racial cadreship, so there were also important communist leading, passive resistance campaigns and so on. All of this impacted very significantly through the late 1940s and into the 50s on the ANC, and enabled the ANC to transform for the first time really into a mass-based and campaigning and relatively effective organization. Ironically, of course, in 1950, the Communist Party was banned, and therefore the activism of party members increasingly became an activism within the Congress movement itself, and therefore strengthened this impact and positive impact, I believe, in this period. And then the second period in which the party was very important, I think, and Tom Lodge certainly agrees with this, was in the late 1960s and through the 70s and into the 80s, when in the mid-60s, of course, the entire movement suffered a massive strategic defeat with the Rivonia trial, with the enforced exile of most of the leadership, imprisonment of the rest, and so forth, a massive strategic defeat. And because the party had been underground through the 1950s and into the 60s and so on, there was a small, tightly organized cadreship with tight recruitment and so forth, which enabled the ANC in exile in the first place to regroup out of its disaster, basically. And the party played a hugely important role in the commissariat of MK and so forth in that period. But now, those two of the key things that were present in one or the other of those key periods have gone missing. So the party is now a mass party. Okay, it's no longer a tight cadreship party. There's no longer probation, and I think that's correct. It shouldn't be tight probation and so on. I'm not sure who the probators are when you do it, but it's a party of some over 300,000 members now, and a high proportion, if you look at the sociology of the party, a high proportion are unemployed youth, which in a sense is a strength for the Communist Party, unlike Communist parties like in Portugal or Greece, who are still clinging on to a largely disappearing blue-collar industrial workers. But you know, it's a youth membership that is unemployed by and large, whereas the leadership, which is a few hundred of the SACP, is mostly employed as ANC deployees, ministers, deputy ministers, councillors, or MECs and so forth, all active in the state, and some, of course, are employed trade unionists. So tensions break out naturally in the sociology. So for the unemployed youth members, there's a sense that some of the party leadership is more ANC than party, and a frustration with this, and calls for the party to contest elections on its own. And part of what lies behind that, as it does in the ANC, is that getting to be elected a councillor is often, or an MEC or an MP or whatever, is often the one shot of escaping a lifetime of drastic unemployment, poverty, and yeah, just stuck in poverty traps. So the politics of this mass membership is not particularly rooted in community organization, and there's some excellent exceptions within the party, but generally, I think we couldn't claim that our branches are active in local struggles, building co-ops, or advancing particular issues, and are much more focused on the politics of politicians, which is the problem the ANC has on steroids, but it is also a problem that the party has. Unfortunately, because we have no resources, it's less heated than the ANC, and partly because the party is not the shortcut into, or was, which ANC once was, and obviously in diminishing ways, less so, a shortcut to some kind of elected position. And then to conclude, sorry, and obviously there are a million things one would want to say, but I'm just trying to flag some key issues. I think Michelle Williams, in her wonderful book, Roots of Participatory Democracy, in which she contrasts the current Communist Party in South Africa with the CPIM, the Communist Party of India, Marxist in Kerala, says that while both parties have a similar strategic agenda of building socialism now, if you like, on the terrain of the existing struggle, In Kerala, the party is much more embedded within local struggles, within popular formations and so forth. In the SACP, unfortunately, for various reasons, that is not the case. So let me end there, Janet, and I look forward to comments, including critical comments, of course, from comrades and colleagues.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jeremy. I did give you a little bit of leeway, a few minutes extra.
All right.
So, but we do have 20 minutes or so for discussion, and I'll welcome any responses to that. Just on your very last point about the membership, you know, there's a long-term study that we've done on COSATU members in South Africa and their involvement in policy making. And one of the questions we always ask is, of shop stewards and ordinary members, is, are you a member of the SACP? And there was a very high correlation of shop stewards with SACP membership. I don't have the most recent results of the most recent survey results here, but it would be interesting to check over time whether that's changed.
Was it an Eastern Cape survey? Eastern Cape survey?
No, it's a national survey.
National
it's called the Trade Union Democracy Project.
Right.
And we've done it with various universities, with members of COSATU unions and shop stewards. So we did a national sample across sectors. So you can get some statistics from there of how SACP membership has been embedded within unions. Yeah, okay, so let's take some responses to Jeremy. I've got Devin and Gary, so I'll take Devin first.
Thanks, Janet. Hi, Jeremy. Good to see you. I'm glad you mentioned Kerala and Michelle's excellent book on Kerala. And the points you make at the end are obviously very valid about the absence of SACP branches in community struggles, etc. So I'm wondering what you would, how you'd respond to a period in the SACP's recent history when Vish Satka was the Gauteng provincial secretary of the party. And he attempted precisely this, from my understanding. I attended some of his workshops, where he tried to locate the SACP within community struggles and to build, for example, community gardens. So around building socialism now in terms of a solidarity economy perspective. And community food gardens, as I'm sure you will agree, is if that received political backing from the party and from trade unions and became a nationwide movement, would have had manifold benefits. Apart from providing food for people and the ability to grow their own, you will be allowing for the self-organization of communities and, of course, spreading the popularity of the party throughout the country. Yet he was completely sidelined, right? I remember him lamenting that he invited party leaders to come to his workshops. Nobody attended. They just ignored him until eventually, when he criticized Zuma, they pushed him out of the party. So I'm wondering what you think. And I know Masibuko late on the South will be talking about solidarity economy and can also add to this. But what is your response to that?
Okay, let me take Gary's input, and Jeremy, if you let me just take a couple and then you can respond to both of them. In fact, the other question might be to Patrick. And yeah, just to say also, Michelle Williams, I invited her to be part of today's session, but she said, unfortunately, she had to apologize. She was traveling today. So, okay, Gary, do you want to go ahead?
Jeremy, fascinating presentation. I'm going to be direct in my question. I love your concept of the SACP's desire to stress revolutionary reforms. Reflect on us for us, if you would, in your 10 years in government, which were the revolutionary reforms that you thought in that era, in your era, and it obviously remains now? What are the things that should be fought for? Exactly which, government policies and programs fall into that would move the country in a better direction? Is it things like the National Health Insurance Plan?
Okay, National Health Insurance, definitely, and other things. Mareka, let me take your question as well, or comment.
Thank you, Prof. And thank you, Jeremy, for that very insightful presentation. I think my question is on, actually, I want to pose it to both yourself, to Gary and his student, what's his name again? Sorry.
Lolonga. Tali.
Lolonga, yes, Lolonga Tali, right? The role of the YCL in the socialist future, YCL used to be quite active. I remember leading up to Polokwane in 97. I know that they even went and established branches in rural areas even. Now, obviously, I'm aware of people like both Lloyd Shivambu, who obviously went on to form the EFF, right, who were really the drivers and very active in the YCL as well. And I think, my question is, given the context now, if I look at what is happening with very high youth unemployment, as a country, we've got really, I think, very large youth cohort. And with the SACP, if YCL is not active, there is a space, there's a gap that is probably missing even within the SACP itself to lead the youth, voice, the youth dialogue, I think, my question is more on the YCL, its role in the socialist future that is currently, I think with all the dynamics that are going on now, maybe perhaps you can share some inputs on that one. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mareka. That's a very relevant question. So let me take Jeremy, if you would like to respond to those three questions. The one about the Gauteng community struggles and gardens, the one about the NHI and other such interventions, and the third about the YCL and the role of the YCL.
Yes, no, thanks very much for the questions. I'm not sure that I've got easy answers. And this is a discussion, obviously a conversation amongst all of us. No, I agree largely with what Devin is saying and his analysis. Obviously, I think the party lost some out, including Michelle, by the way, Williams was also a party member. And obviously the tumultuous period of 2007, 8, 9, that period, in which there were sharp divisions inside of the party, around supporting Zuma and what that support meant. And I think that some outstanding people, and you mentioned names like Comrade Mazibuku, Comrade Vish, Michelle and others, were sort of elbowed out of the party. And I think it was a great loss to the party. And yeah. So I don't disagree. And I agree with you that things like community food gardens and things that Vish continues to work on, are absolutely critical and are, in my view, parts of building elements of socialism, socialist momentum, and just building community cohesion in communities that are so riddled with crime, unemployment, dysfunctionalities of all kinds. It's so important. In recent times, I've had some engagements with Vish, for instance, particularly when I was the Deputy Minister in Public Works, and I was asked by Ramaphosa to be the sort of champion of the public employment programs. And I was very anxious to explore connections between the cooperative movement that Vish was involved in and the public employment programs. And there are, in practice, including Janet in KwaZulu itself, some very interesting examples of public employment funding going into existing NGOs who are doing wonderful work in terms of community healthcare, food gardens, and so forth. But I think that, of course, comments got a bit burned by the kind of rather state-centric Zoomification of the party at one point, and I'm exaggerating the point because I don't think it was entirely that, that there's quite a lot of suspicion, which one understands, about any state interference and involvement. And that's why part of revolutionary reforms, Gary, is understanding that they need to be both state and people driven. It's this co-production of transformation that I think is so important. But I understand why there are often lots of suspicions about the agenda of the state and the dangers of excessive party political politicization of initiatives. So I hope I sort of engage with, obviously it's a long discussion that Devin and I should have, and I've been meaning to have with you, Devin. Gary, yeah, no, thanks for appreciating the notion of revolutionary reforms. Okay. My 10 years in government, I wasn't in cabinet, by the way, Janet. I was a deputy minister, so we're not members of cabinet, but we participate in what I call cabinet committees and so forth. And what would I see areas where there was potential to advance? So I think you've mentioned some of them, Gary and Lolonga. The one would be industrial policy. And I think that Rob Davies struggled and had some successes in that front. But essentially, it was always massively under-resourced, underfunded. And I think that was a weakness. What you didn't look at was because Rob was also, of course, Minister of Trade and Industry, and much of his energy was focused on the trade. In the mid-1990s, part of GEAR was, I mean, we went terrible on trade policy and basically just opened doors and windows because we imagined that with massive foreign investment coming in. And of course, what happened was that there was massive capital flight out of the country. So I think that there was an attempt to tighten up on trade policy to assist industrialization and job creation in the country. And I think also under Minister Patel currently, I think that those efforts are continued. But it's very easy sliding down the pole into so-called free trade and very hard climbing up it again. But I mean, that's certainly a battle that has to be fought. NHI, yes, absolutely, would be a very important revolutionary reform. I've mentioned public employment programs, yes. And I think also a theme that Janet and Patrick and others are advancing, decentralization. So I was also Deputy Minister at some point of transport. And what I realized was this over-centralization of transport planning, and it's delinking from spatial planning is part of the huge problem. So these RDP housing projects, just massively undermined the possibility. And then the fact that something like Metro Rail was nationally owned rather than linked into urban and local-led planning, spatial planning as a problem. And lots more, but yeah. And then I see Lolonga is also on the chat group said he'd like to have some chances of further interviews and so on some of the topics that you're looking at. And I obviously would be more than willing to be, not to give you the line, but to give you a perspective from the side of the party as to what. YC Almareka, yeah. And also, I noticed also on the chat group, a number of comments, including what you said, Janet, at the beginning, I'm perhaps being unfair to the party's 300,000 plus membership. I mean, everywhere there are party comrades that are involved, like in your group, your transitional economy project, there are party members involved in it. And you'll find that throughout the country in co-ops and so on. Wonderful comrades who are doing that. Wonderful EFF comrades, by the way. I don't very much like Floyd Shivambu or his boss. But we should not neglect youth activism, which is often evoked and it's, by the EFF. On the ground, I've run into many wonderful young EFFers. Okay, so the YCL, yes, it has a really important role. But what is the political culture of the youth, generally speaking? Political culture. And I think a lot of it is still quite informed by experiences of electoral politics, whether at university through SASCOs and Progressive Front, Unity and so forth, whether at a national, provincial, district level, electoral politics of party politicians and so forth. And a lot of it's informed by just this massive unemployment, which we need to understand. It's all very well for Jeremy Cronin in the party leadership to say that I don't think it's a very good idea for the party to campaign electorally, because I don't think the party would get more than about 5%, frankly. But when I say that, well, I'm retired now, but when I say that, it looks like I'm very happy to be an ANC deployed deputy minister and cutting out, you know, hundreds of thousands of young people whose one chance, as I said earlier, of getting some kind of employment or connection to employment is because they're part of the network of an SACP councillor or whatever. So I think as Pedro was trying to say earlier, the corrupting influence of unemployment. You know, we're playing electoral politics on this terrain of this massive 70% plus youth unemployment. So it's a big battle, and it's an important battle that the YCLers, Mareka, should certainly engage with in a constructive way, and they do try. There's no doubt about it, but I think we're all up against this huge challenge. Thanks, Janet.
Thanks, Jeremy. There are a couple of questions on the chat, and I'm going to give you a chance to respond to those as well. The first is Paulo Jordan, who says, wasn't the significance of the Black Republic the recognition that the revolutionary agent in South Africa would be the Black working class and not, as previously assumed, the white working class? And then he says, in that respect, Bunting's remarks are off the wall. And you can respond to that if you want. And then Jean Wilderfunk says, what did you I presume she's addressing this to you, Jeremy. What did you personally do while part of Zuma's government to stop the flight of well-intended capital from rural upliftment projects to corrupt elites, even all the way to Dubai? So I don't know if you can respond to those two questions just to finish off the session. And then I've got a question from Stephen Margot. Stephen, can I take your question? And then Jeremy can respond to those three before we wind up. Stephen?
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Janet. Thanks, colleagues, for those brilliant presentations. I don't know, you could help me. I always wonder, I fail to reconcile, you know, the South African economy. It's a huge economy, the biggest in sub-Saharan Africa, and also with massive resources, human, physical resources, name it. And what I fail to reconcile with is that it continues to grapple with high levels of poverty, high levels of inequality, the highest in the world, and high unemployment. So what could be the central problem, looking at all the discussions that have been ensuing? What could be are we able to find the root cause, the central cause that need to be nipped off the bud so that, you know, South Africa can recover in one way or the other? Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. And then, Jeremy, I don't know if you can read Paula Jordan's follow-up question or comment here, which you can maybe relate to the other one about the Black Republic, although it's a more contemporary question here about the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. Can you read that? Since 1978,
Yeah,
it's harnessed the immense talents of the remnants of the Chinese bourgeoisie to drive rapid industrialization of China. Can there be no convergence of interests between the black bourgeoisie and the working class in South Africa? Very interesting question. If the black bourgeoisie is delinked from monopolies, could there not be a convergence of interests? So let me take, if you can take those last few questions before we wrap up. It's fine. If people don't want to listen, that's fine. We can go ahead. Just go ahead. Okay. Take your time.
Okay, thanks. Okay, and hi, Paolo. And of course, questions that are hard to answer in a couple of minutes. But first of all, the on Black Republic, basically what the Comintern said and the party resolved in 1929 in adopting the Comintern resolution was that the first stage of struggle was a struggle of the workers and poor. It didn't say black workers and black poor, but the struggle of the workers and poor, essentially for majority rule in South Africa, and identifying the key contradiction and therefore the key motive forces of transfer, and the key contradiction being the national oppression of the majority of South Africa. So I think that was correct as a characterization. Okay, so yes, it identified the black strata. I don't think there's a black working class and a white working class in South Africa. There's a working class. I don't think there's a black bourgeoisie and a white bourgeoisie in South Africa. There's a capitalist class with various stratifications and differentials and so on. So I don't think that Bunting was off the wall. Maybe he was saying there shouldn't be a wall, okay, referring to another wall. What he was saying is that we mustn't think of the socialist struggle as separate from, the word wasn't used there, a national democratic revolution, the struggle for a black republic, the struggle for majority rule with minority rights guaranteed, as the Comintern phrase put it. So yeah, but then linking it to the next question, which is not unrelated, where Paulo says in the chat group that you know, the Chinese Communist Party, since with the Deng Xiaoping reforms since 1978, harnessed the talents and remnants of the Chinese bourgeoisie to drive massive industrialization. Now, the problem is, in 1978, China was an extremely poor country with some remnants of a bourgeoisie in place. In 1990, 1994, South Africa's long had a South African bourgeoisie. South Africa's industrialization has long taken place. South Africa's proletarianization of the majority of South Africans has long taken place with the expropriation of land and so forth, and taxation enforced on the native reserves and so forth. So the idea that somehow a patriotic bourgeoisie could emerge, how? Basically, the way in which the supposed patriotic bourgeoisie has emerged has been through regulated shareholding requirements, BE requirements, and through the basic pillaging of public resources, the Transnets, the Metro Rails, the Escoms, and so forth. That is how the primary accumulation processes happened. And that's created two strata within the existing capitalist class. One, more compradorist, basically, you know, working with and for and sharing the worldviews by and large of monopoly capital, both global as well as local, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the state looters, basically, justifying their activity in the name of black economic empowerment. But that's not to say that, and I think someone else earlier raised that point, it was Patrick, who raised the point about the possibility of local capitalists, in the case of Patrick's argument, sharing some objectives in the face of the massive onslaught of transnational and monopoly capital, financialization, and so on. Absolutely, there are possibilities, and some of those, there's no reason why they should be black or white, those capitalists. The fact that people have particular colors of skin doesn't necessarily make them more or less patriotic. Objectively, I mean, subjectively, there might be more supporting the ANC or whatever. But objectively, the way in which small capital in South Africa is located, the way in which quite a lot of productive manufacturing capital is located, is under the thumb of the financial sector, the mining sector, the dominant sectors. And there are possibilities of working with those sectors. And I think that that's part of the current government's approach to what we're calling black industrialists. In other words, not empowering people who are aspirant capitalists without capital, but small scale or medium scale productive people who then receive much more effective state support rather than just, diverting surplus into those who've got zero experience or interest, basically, in productive activity, or just basically shareholders, for instance. So I'm sure I've not convinced Paolo, but anyway, that's a discussion Paolo and I have been having for quite a long time over numbers of years. I've now forgotten Jean's question. Oh, what did I do personally to stop? Okay, I don't want to get too much into that, not because I don't want to say a lot of things, but a hard and horrible battle was being fought through the Zuma years, the Zuma presidency from 2008 through until his demise, forced demise, in which the party, by the way, and some of the insider things played something of a role in getting him out. But yeah, let me leave it at that. I mean, because it becomes self-justificatory and so on, and I think I don't want to particularly go there. And then Stephen Marco asks the big question. Okay, here we've got the biggest economy, not just in sub-Saharan Africa, but in Africa, basically, huge resources and so forth, and yet we've got the most unequal society, huge crisis levels of unemployment, and so on. And I was trying to answer that in effect by saying that the changes that we've brought about by and large have not been transformative since 1994. And some of the changes, some of the reforms that we've brought about have locked us in even more firmly into a hugely problematic path dependency in which we continue to be a semi-peripheral economy in the global setup of things. And internally within our country, we are reproducing all of the crises of social reproduction in a variety of ways. So obviously it would be a thesis on its own to try and is a thesis and an ongoing discussion. But thanks, Stephen, for the question. I know I haven't answered it adequately, but hopefully the PowerPoint presentation pointed in some of the directions which I believe we need to go in order to structurally transform the continued reproduction of these crises of unemployment, poverty, and inequality, which are all racialized, gendered, and spatialized as well. Thanks very much. Thanks to everyone.
Right. Thank you, Jeremy. Also, Peter Lim, thanks for your comment about Chinese socialism, which is interesting, but I think we're not going to pick up on that now. Just to conclude the session, firstly, to thank both of our presenters very much. I think it was a very, very challenging and stimulating session. Just for those of you who've just joined us, Alison, Drew, I see you are here, welcome. The afternoon session will start at 2 o'clock and you need to register on a separate link for the afternoon session, the 2 o'clock to 5 o'clock session. So please won't you all come back at 2 o'clock and come on to the next session then. The other question I just wanted to answer, in case you're not coming back this afternoon, what happens to the papers that were presented here? I'll be discussing with the other hosts of the series what we do in terms of publication, but we're looking at some form of publication of some of the papers. I don't know what form that will take, but I will get back to all the presenters and ask if you want to be part of a publication process. We might also make them available on the SAHO website or other forums. So we will contact all the presenters about that, and those of you who are interested obviously will have access to them in some way or another. Yeah, so basically we're going to come back and follow on the debate. Jeremy and I have a sort of private joke about trying to bring the left in and the left out together. And this afternoon session, we're going to look at some other alternatives to socialist futures and socialist experiments. And I hope you're going to join us in that panel as well. So yeah, thank you all very much. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you all this afternoon.